Welcome, my frightful flyers. Tonight, I have a high-flying horror story that's sure to take you on a turbulent trip to terror. Meet a high-powered attorney who thought her biggest fear was missing a deadline. But she's about to discover that some red eyes don't just leave you dead tired. It's a journey through shadows, screams, and skies where the seatbelt sign isn't the only thing keeping you strapped in. So, pack your bags with courage, my fiends, and prepare for a red-eye flight into a void of horror and heart-stopping suspense. Let's ascend into tonight's bone-chilling tale, The Last Ascent.
The cabin lights flickered, their weak glow casting jittery shadows that stretched and twisted unnaturally, as though something alive lurked just beyond sight. The engines hummed, a relentless drone that felt more like an ominous warning than mere white noise. Steady, insistent, and unnervingly loud, like a heartbeat racing out of sync with reality. I glanced at my watch, 3:17 a.m. The glowing numbers pierced the dimness, a stark reminder of the dead hours when the world was supposed to sleep. Yet it never truly did. Something always stirred. This is your captain speaking. We'll be cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight, the intercom crackled. The voice was calm and rehearsed, plucked straight from an outdated in-flight manual. But there was a hitch. A pause too long between relax and enjoy. The words landed wrong, as if masking an unspoken warning. My stomach churned, the turbulence beneath us less a shudder of air currents and more a hesitation. A momentary falter, as though the plane itself questioned its place in the sky. The unease gnawed at me, familiar in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. Maybe it was the exhaustion talking. Or maybe this was what red-eye flights did to you, left you stranded in the in-between, suspended between two worlds, belonging to neither. I leaned back against the headrest, closing my eyes, willing my body to relax, even as my mind raced with relentless urgency. Deadlines, contracts, courtrooms. My thoughts churned, a ceaseless storm of arguments, evidence, and perfectly rehearsed closing statements. This flight wasn't just a red-eye inconvenience, it was a lifeline. A bridge between the grinding mediocrity I'd left behind and the success I had chased for years. By sunrise, I needed to be in Chicago. The deal waiting for me there wasn't just important, it was everything. My chance to prove that I wasn't just another overworked cog in the legal machine. For too many years, I'd clawed my way out of mediocrity's shadows, battling whispers of doubt, sometimes from others, but mostly from myself. Now success was so close I could taste it. All I had to do was survive this sleepless journey, a trial of endurance, willpower, and caffeine. The cabin was quiet. The occasional cough or rustle of a blanket punctuated the stillness, while the faint blue glow of seatback screens bathed the rows of sleeping passengers. I envied them. To sleep so easily, as if they weren't hurtling through the dark at 500 miles an hour, felt like a kind of magic I'd forgotten. Me? Peaceful sleep had become a foreign concept. Even now, with nothing to do but wait, the quiet pressed down on me heavier than it should, like an unseen weight on my chest. And then there was the man in seat 13A. I hadn't seen him board. I couldn't even be sure how long he'd been there. He sat unnervingly still, his face swallowed by shadows. Yet his presence was undeniable, like a hum just below the range of hearing. My gaze kept drifting back to him, tugged by something primal, something wrong. Rationality begged me to look away, to chalk it up to exhaustion. But rationality was losing. Desperate for distraction, I turned my attention to my laptop, pretending to review tomorrow's notes. The glow of the screen felt like a small island of safety, bright enough to chase away the edges of the dark, but not bright enough to banish the growing dread pooling in my stomach. No matter how hard I tried to focus, my thoughts kept circling back, to seat 13A. To him, something was off. No, something was terribly, undeniably off. The turbulence hit like an unseen hand slamming into the plane, rattling the drink on the tray table in front of me. A low murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers stirred, their groggy faces flickering with alarm. I gripped the armrest tightly, my knuckles blanching as I struggled to steady my breathing. Each jolt felt deliberate, personal, like the sky itself was rejecting us. "This is your captain speaking," the voice returned, calm but distant, as though carried from another world entirely. "We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The words were too smooth, too mechanical, stripped of any real reassurance. They only made the fear sharper, more acute. Another jolt came, sharper, harder. Gasps filled the air, sharp and jagged, and then the plane dipped, just for a second, but it was long enough to feel the sickening pull of gravity slip beneath us. My stomach clenched as if it were trying to escape, a primal response to the sudden betrayal of the laws of physics. And then the screaming began. It erupted from the back of the plane, a piercing wail that sliced through the cabin like a knife. It wasn't just loud, it reached inside your chest and squeezed, refusing to let go. I twisted in my seat, craning to see past the sea of heads and seats. Chaos unfolded. Passengers recoiling, a flurry of panicked movement, and a flight attendant rushing toward the commotion. Her face was as pale as chalk, her wide eyes betraying something far worse than fear, recognition. The lights flickered, their weak glow stuttering in and out like a dying pulse. Then, darkness. The cabin plunged into an oppressive silence, broken only by the drone of the engines and the relentless pounding of my heart. The emergency exit signs glowed faintly, casting the cabin in eerie shades of red and shadow, like a scene from a waking nightmare. When the lights returned, my gaze was immediately drawn to the aisle. A figure stood there, perfectly still, facing away from me. It was the man from 13A. He shouldn't have been standing. The turbulence wasn't just violent, it was vengeful, shaking the plane with a fury that rattled overhead bins and sent stray belongings tumbling into the aisles. Yet there he stood, motionless, as though the chaos around him didn't exist. His posture was unnaturally rigid, his head tilted slightly to one side, like he was listening. Not to the hum of the engines or the panicked murmurs of passengers, but to something else, something only he could hear. And then, as though he felt the weight of my stare, he turned. His eyes, bloodshot, wide, and unblinking, locked onto mine with an intensity that felt like a physical blow. A shiver surged down my spine, cold and electric, rooting me to my seat. His mouth moved, forming slow, deliberate shapes, the way someone might practice unfamiliar words. But no sound came. It wasn't silence. It was a grotesque mimicry of speech, as if he were mocking language itself. I wanted to look away, to scream, to move, anything. But I couldn't. My body betrayed me, frozen in place, as if bound by the same unseen force tethering him to the aisle. Every instinct screamed danger, yet I sat there, silent and paralyzed, trapped in the unrelenting grip of his stare. "Ma'am?" The voice broke through like a lifeline, snapping the spell. I jerked my head to the side, finding a flight attendant crouched beside me. Her face was tight, her eyes scanning me with a mix of concern and unease. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough to betray her composure. I blinked, dragging in a shaky breath. My gaze darted back to the aisle. Empty. Seat 13A was empty. "Did you see him?" I whispered, the words tumbling out in a breathless rush. My voice felt fragile, barely audible above the drone of the engines. The flight attendant's frown deepened, confusion clouding her expression. "See who?" she asked softly, her tone careful, almost too neutral, like she didn't believe me. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't even convince myself it was real. Maybe it was exhaustion, the byproduct of too many sleepless nights chasing something just out of reach. Maybe it was stress, the kind that sank into your bones and turned shadows into specters. But deep down I knew this wasn't just in my head. The turbulence subsided, but the unease didn't. It lingered, coiling around the cabin like smoke only I could see. Passengers exchanged nervous whispers, their earlier fear now settling into a heavy, oppressive silence. The kind of silence that made you acutely aware of how fragile the boundary between order and chaos really was. I turned my attention to the spreadsheets glowing on my laptop screen. The numbers swam, out of focus, as my trembling hands struggled to find the keys. I tried to ground myself, pulling on memories of all the times I'd faced impossible odds in court. The late nights, the meticulous preparations, the rehearsed arguments that had forged me into someone unshakable, someone who could stare fear in the face and emerge victorious. But this wasn't a courtroom. There were no rules to follow, no precedents to lean on, no way to argue my way out of the creeping dread tightening its grip on my thoughts. For the first time in years, I felt small, exposed, like the armor I'd spent a lifetime crafting had been shattered by one unrelenting gaze. Then I heard it. A sound so faint, it might have been my own thoughts turning against me. Low and guttural, it wove through the cabin, threading into the stillness. The cadence was wrong, unnatural, like someone shaping words they didn't quite understand. My gaze snapped to the intercom. The sound was coming from there. The whispering swelled, a storm gathering strength, its insidious chant slithering through the air. My heart pounded against my ribs as my eyes darted around the cabin, desperate for the source. The other passengers sat motionless, their wide, unseeing eyes fixed on nothing. Their faces were masks of silent terror, frozen mid-scream. They weren't just afraid, they were absent. Their humanity had been wiped clean, erased like chalk under relentless waves. The intercom crackled to life, its static filling the cabin like an unwelcome guest. But this time, it wasn't the captain's voice. It was something deeper, rasping, guttural, and wrong. The words were twisted, fragmented, like a language dragged from the depths of an abyss. And yet, I understood. The meaning seeped into my mind, unbidden and inescapable. Your choices brought you here. There is no escape. The plane shuddered violently as if recoiling from the words. Overhead compartments burst open, spilling luggage onto the floor like organs from a ruptured body. Oxygen masks dropped with a hiss, their yellowed plastic faces dangling like lifeless puppets. The lights flickered, dimming until the cabin was consumed by a darkness so dense it felt alive, pressing against my skin. And then he appeared. The man from 13A stood in the aisle, his body grotesquely wrong, limbs bent at unnatural angles, like a marionette controlled by a cruel hand. His skin, sallow and stretched impossibly tight, clung to jagged bones that jutted like shards of broken glass. His eyes glowed a sickly, pulsing red, their light cutting through the shadows like the gaze of a predator stalking its prey. He raised a hand, his fingers elongated and claw-like. The whispering ceased instantly. Silence descended, thick, suffocating, and absolute. It wrapped around me like a vice, squeezing the air from my lungs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The absence of sound was worse than the whispers, an emptiness so profound it felt like the void itself had swallowed the world whole. "This flight doesn't land," he rasped, his voice ancient and inhuman, each syllable vibrating through the cabin like a seismic tremor. "Not unless you make it land." I stood trembling, my legs weak beneath me, but something deeper, instinct, desperation, forced me to stay upright. "What do you want from us?" I demanded, though my voice cracked, betraying the courage I was struggling to muster. He tilted his head, the movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring the question. His grin stretched impossibly wide, a jagged crescent that didn't belong on any human face. "This plane is mine now," he said, his voice a low rumble that reverberated in the oppressive silence. "But one of you can take it back." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My breath hitched, my mind scrambling to process them. "What do you mean?" I asked, though dread curled around my thoughts, whispering the answer I didn't want to hear. He raised an arm, moving with unsettling deliberation, and pointed toward the cockpit door. "The controls. The choice. You." The realization hit me like a plunge into icy water. The engines had gone silent. The plane no longer surged forward. Outside the window there was nothing. No sky, no clouds, no stars. Only an endless, starless void stretching in every direction. We weren't flying, we weren't anywhere. He stepped closer, his movements unnervingly fluid, his grin morphing into something grotesque and predatory. "Someone must take my place," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "A trade, one soul to guide this vessel of despair." His words crushed me, each syllable dragging me deeper into a reality I couldn't deny. The plane wasn't just a vehicle. It was a prison, a purgatory. The passengers weren't just trapped. They were condemned, suspended in a liminal space where escape didn't exist. My mind raced, grasping for logic, for reason. Was this a nightmare? An exhaustion-fueled hallucination? A twisted figment of my overstressed mind? But as I looked around, the truth settled over me like a shroud. The passengers weren't looking at me, they were staring through me, their wide, hollow eyes fixed on nothing. Their faces were pale, their expressions locked in terror. This wasn't just happening to me. It wasn't in my head. It was real. And I was the only one standing between them and eternal damnation. I took a hesitant step toward the cockpit, each movement heavy, as if the weight of every soul on this plane bore down on me. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drumbeat echoing the dread clawing at my thoughts. The thing in the aisle watched me intently, its glowing red eyes flaring brighter, their light cutting through the gloom like embers of a dying fire. "Good," it whispered, its voice curling around the cabin like smoke. "Insidious and suffocating. Sacrifice is strength." My trembling hand reached for the cockpit door, fingers hovering inches from the handle. The metal felt cold even without touching it, a foreboding barrier between salvation and damnation. But then a voice, soft and fragile, broke through the suffocating silence. "Don't." I froze, My breath hitched, my chest tightening as I turned toward the sound. A little girl stood a few rows behind me, clutching a battered teddy bear against her chest. Her wide, tear-streaked eyes locked onto mine, brimming with fear and trust. "Please don't leave us," she whispered, her words barely audible, yet they struck like a thunderclap. The weight in my chest grew heavier, colder. My gaze darted back to the thing in the aisle. Its grotesque grin faltered, just for an instant. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Not fear, no, something closer to frustration, even desperation. And in that moment, as its predatory composure cracked, the truth unfurled like a dark, suffocating fog. The real horror wasn't the creature standing before me, its twisted body, or the endless void outside the windows. The real horror was the choice. It didn't just want me to take the controls, it wanted me to become it, to take its place, to condemn myself to this endless, starless purgatory. A cycle of despair passed from one soul to the next, an unbroken chain of torment. But if I refused, tick-tock, it hissed, its voice sharp and venomous, reverberating through the cabin like the tick of a clock counting down to something unthinkable. The cabin was suffocatingly still, the kind of silence that amplified every sound, each shallow breath, each frantic heartbeat, until it became deafening. Hollow, pleading eyes were fixed on me, their collective fear pressing against me like a tangible weight. The little girl's trembling voice echoed in my mind, fragile yet defiant, a counterpoint to the creature's rasping whispers. My knees threatened to buckle, but something deep inside refused to break. I straightened, forcing myself to stand tall, even as every fiber of my being screamed to collapse. I turned to meet the creature's glowing red eyes, their pulsing light like embers on the verge of eruption. "No," I said, the word barely audible, trembling in the air. Then again, louder, stronger. "No!" Its grin evaporated, twisting into a snarl that exposed jagged, blackened teeth. "No!" it growled, the sound a low rumble that reverberated through the cabin, making the air itself feel unstable. "I'm not playing your game," I said, my voice cracking but unwavering. "You want me to take your place? To become like you? To trap these people in this nightmare? Not a chance." The creature laughed, a guttural, bone-deep sound that rippled through the walls. It wasn't just mocking. It was ancient, cruel, and predatory. "You think defiance saves you?" it hissed, stepping closer, its shadow elongating unnaturally, swallowing the cabin in darkness. "Foolish girl, you've already lost. You're already mine." The plane groaned violently, the walls trembling as though the vessel itself were alive, straining under the weight of my defiance. Lights strobed erratically, casting jagged flashes of crimson and shadow that painted the scene in chaos. The creature lunged, its clawed hands stretching impossibly long, a mass of shadow and malice aimed straight for my chest. Instinct surged to the forefront, overriding thought. My hand shot up, grabbing the oxygen mask dangling overhead. Its yellow plastic glowed faintly in the flickering light. With every ounce of strength I had left, I swung it like a lifeline. The mask struck the creature's head with a sharp, jarring crack that sent a jolt up my arm. For a moment, its form flickered, wavering like static on a broken screen. The pulsing red eyes dimmed, faltering for the first time. Its grin returned, smaller but no less sinister. "You can't break me," it whispered, its voice fractured and distorted. "But you've made your choice." I stumbled toward the cockpit, each step a battle against the suffocating weight pressing down on me. My lungs burned with every ragged breath, each gasp threatening to be my last. The door creaked open, revealing a console bathed in an unsettling, pulsing red light. The controls weren't mechanical. They were alive. Twisting, organic shapes writhed and pulsed, slick and glistening like the skin of some unknowable creature anticipating my touch. Behind me, the creature's voice slithered through the chaos, sharp and venomous. "It's too late," it hissed, every word dripping with malice. "There's no going back. Take the controls or we all fade into the void." The passengers screamed, a discordant symphony of terror. I turned, my gaze sweeping the cabin in search of an anchor amidst the madness. Then I saw her, the little girl clutching her battered teddy bear like a lifeline. Her lips moved in a silent prayer, and her wide, glistening eyes met mine. In their quiet resilience, I found a bolt of clarity. My hands hovered over the alien console, trembling. Could I do it? Could I make the sacrifice, bind myself to this nightmare, and save these people from an eternity in limbo? But then it hit me. This wasn't about sacrifice. It was about control. His game wasn't built on power. It was built on fear, on manipulation, making me believe I had no choice. "No," I whispered. The word sparked something deep inside me. No, I turned away from the writhing console, ignoring the phantom's screech of rage. The sound clawed at the edges of my mind, but I bolted down the aisle, unyielding. Everyone, get up! Move toward the emergency exits! I shouted, my voice cutting through the cacophony like a whip. But where? A man stammered, his voice strangled with panic. Do it! Now! I roared, the urgency in my tone snapping him into action. One by one, the passengers stirred from their paralysis, their terror giving way to desperate movement. The creature howled, its form swelling grotesquely, limbs twisting and expanding as it seemed to feed on the lingering fear in the air. Its glowing red eyes blazed brighter, casting jagged, monstrous shadows across the cabin. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Reaching the emergency door, I gripped the handle, my hands trembling with strength I hadn't realized I possessed. You can't escape me, the creature bellowed, its voice rattling the walls and vibrating through my bones. But I refused to falter. With a final cry, I yanked the handle. The cabin erupted in a deafening roar as the door flew open, and the void outside surged toward us, a swirling maw of endless nothingness, hungry and all-consuming. But in that moment, amidst the chaos and despair, I felt it, a glimmer of hope, a chance to break free. The creature's shriek tore through the cabin, a raw, primal sound that reverberated in my chest like the death cry of something ancient. Its form unraveled, shadow and malice peeling away in the violent rush of air. The void outside the emergency door writhed and twisted, collapsing in on itself like a dying star. And then there was light. Blinding, radiant light flooded the cabin, chasing away the darkness and bathing everything in a warmth so profound it felt like a lifeline. It wasn't just light, it was clarity. A breath drawn after drowning. The screams ceased. The chaos dissolved. For a fleeting moment, it was as if we had all woken up. I blinked against the brilliance, my breath hitching in my throat. The familiar hum of the engines filled the air, steady and grounding. The cabin lights glowed gently above, ordinary and unassuming. I was in my seat, upright, my seatbelt fastened as though nothing had happened. Around me, passengers stirred, their expressions slack with confusion, as if emerging from the haze of a collective nightmare. A few rows ahead, the little girl sat clutching her teddy bear. Her wide eyes found mine, calm and steady, no longer brimming with tears. There was something in her gaze, an understanding, a recognition that seemed far older than her years. She nodded once, subtle and deliberate, before turning back to the window. This is your captain speaking, the intercom crackled, its tone professional and practiced. We'll be landing in Chicago shortly. Thank you for flying with us. I gripped the armrest tightly, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. Outside the window, the void was gone, replaced by the glittering sprawl of Chicago's city lights. It was over. Somehow we'd made it. But as I stepped off the plane, my chest heavy with relief, a shadow of doubt lingered. The air in the jet bridge felt too still, too quiet. I glanced back toward the cockpit, just as the door swung shut with a soft, deliberate click. For the briefest moment, I saw them. Two glowing red eyes, faint but unmistakable, watching from the dim light. A whisper followed me into the terminal, soft and almost playful, curling around me like a lingering promise. See you next time.
Well, boils and ghouls. Wasn't that a first-class fright? Poor Amy thought she could lawyer her way out of anything, but it looks like she got grounded. Hehehe. She learned the hard way that even the sky isn't the limit when it comes to fearsome flights and fiendish fares. And as for our mysterious passenger from seat 13A, let's just say he'll be keeping his frequent fear miles for eternity. So, my precious passengers, what would you have done? Taken the controls, made the sacrifice, or just stayed in your seat and winged it? Share your terrifying thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that Scream subscribe button before you deplane. After all, we wouldn't want you to miss the next tale from the terminal. Hehehe. Until next time, kiddies, keep your tray tables up and your terror levels high.